We're just going live. Good afternoon. Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, December 2nd, 2020. My name is Drew Clark, and I am the editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Thanks for being with us for another edition of Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We're in the middle of three concurrent sessions or topics on our Breakfast Live Online series. One of them is on broadband and the Biden administration. The other, which we're talking about today, the other is on a no-nonsense guide to 5G, and that will be our topic next Wednesday, December 9th. And the third is tools for broadband deployment, and that will be on the 16th of December. So we're kind of rotating among those three series. We will also have some special sessions focused on year-end, December 23rd and December 30th, but we'll be announcing those in due course. And I certainly invite all of you to sign up to our twice weekly email alert at broadbandbreakfast.com, where you can make sure to stay up to speed on all the activities that we have going and taking place. Without any further ado, I though want to welcome two of our three panelists. We are going to have a third panelist who will join us halfway through the program. And once again, this is the second of three series we're doing on broadband and the Biden administration. We did one 2 or 3 weeks ago on the views of two people who were involved in the Obama and Trump administration transitions. Today, we're going to be hearing from several industry voices. And then in January, we'll be hearing from some public interest groups. But without, like I said, further ado, let's turn to Chip Pickering. Chip, we're so glad you could be with us. Thank you. Chip, of course, is the CEO of Encompass, which I didn't realize until recently is actually an acronym, right?
Internet and Competitive Networks.
Internet and Competitive Networks Association. So awesome. Thanks for being with us, Chip. And we also have, as well, Matt Schurz. He's the president of CCIA, which is the Computer and Communications Industry Association. Thank you for being with us. CCIA was a sponsor of a series we did earlier in the year on Section 230, which we thought was a great contribution early in the controversy, which continues, right? Just today, in fact, there's news, which we'll talk about just now. So, but we're going to start with Chip. So go ahead, Chip. Tell us a little bit about, in addition to, you're the head of Encompass, but that really undersells you. You were quite involved in the 96 Telecom Act. And of course, you're a six-term former representative from the great state of Mississippi. So thanks again for being with us, Chip. Tell us a little bit about your perspective for where the world stands in broadband right now, the tail end of 2020.
Well, Drew, thank you. It's very good to be with you and everyone joining virtually. As we look at the end of 2020 going into 2021, a new administration, new Congress, very close majorities in the House and in the Senate. And as I look over my last 30 years in public policy work, both from within Congress, staffer and as a member, and from the outside as an advocate and now as CEO of Encompass, I believe the next 2 years are really going to be one of those once every 2 decade periods where we have transformational policy being made. And at the end of 2020, what is hard to even imagine 9 months ago when COVID hit and our economy was shut down and broadband connectivity became the critical linchpin of keeping everyone connected, our economy running, our schools open and teaching and instructing virtually and remotely, for our healthcare and telehealth and telemedicine. The broadband networks really rose to the challenge, and a new consensus emerged around the country that broadband connectivity is now just a want to or need to, but it is a must have for all parts of the country and for every American in the country. So I think you'll see this new bipartisan consensus emerge, and the new leadership, both of Congress and the new administration and the commission. It will be a primary focus of how do we get all Americans connected? How quickly can we do that? What are the parameters around how we reform our funding mechanisms? And we'll see more funding going to broadband connectivity than anyone could imagine in our lifetime. And so I'll stop there. I think that's going to be the major national priority in the infrastructure bill that is and stimulus bill that is likely to come in the first 100 days. It'll be the major focus of the commission, both in the acting chair as well as whatever the full new commission will be sometime into the next year. Broadband connectivity, and around that, there will be competition principles, there'll be equity principles related to education, healthcare, lifeline, low income. How do we make sure that everyone has the tools of the 21st century?
Well, thank you, and thanks for really highlighting this more funding piece. We'll certainly talk more about this. Let's turn to you, Matt. I know that so much of your time is spent on the computing side of your association's name, but tell us a little about the communications portion and some of the issues that you see for broadband in the next administration.
Certainly. So thanks, Drew, for having me on the program. I'm glad to have a chance to talk with you today and be here with Chip. I think I'll agree with just about everything that Chip was saying. I think taking a step back, there's no question that in the short run, the top priority for the administration is overcoming the current public health crisis and the economic consequences of that. And so that might lead one to say, well, technology policy and communications policy are take a second seat to that. But I think, as Chip pointed out, we're seeing how communications and technology are in fact critical to fighting the pandemic. And more than ever before, we need people to be able to work, to study, to shop, to socialize and engage in prayer remotely. And high-speed internet and the digital services that utilize that internet are essential to that. Unfortunately, we're deep in the woods in this crisis, and technology has to play a role in getting out of it. And so I think for the incoming administration, that means figuring out how to close the digital divide that we've long recognized is there, that access to high-speed communications and tech is often a function of socioeconomic and geographic conditions. And that's not right. It's not good for our country. It's not good for the nation's economy. And so figuring out how to close those gaps is part of it. Certainly, providing, as Chip mentioned, funding for broadband is one critical solution we need to do with access and deployment. There is also the important component of wireless broadband, right? Which is, and I think increasingly 5G is going to be a means by which we close the broadband gap, and doing things like opening up 12 gigahertz spectrum and pursuing open standards like O-RAN are all strategies that we can use to help close that gap as quickly as possible.
Well, thank you for that, and for flagging a couple of those issues there. Let's take a moment to talk about the elephant in the room, this Section 230 issue, which has really rocketed to prominence, not just over the past year, but past 12 hours, right, to 24 hours. Reports that President Trump is holding the defense appropriations bill until Section 230 is repealed. Matt, why don't you take this one, at least first stab at it? What do you make of what's real and what's noise in the discussions around Section 230, particularly from the Trump administration, including the appointment, which has now cleared the Senate Commerce Committee out as of this morning, according to Broadband breakfast reports, that Nate Symington is now going to the full Senate. And of course, Mr. Symington still is at the Commerce Department, which was the entity that put forth the petition for the FCC to define terms of Section 230. So, Matt, what's real, what's noise, what needs to be focused on this issue?
Yeah, thanks, Drew. No, I think that's a critical question. I know Broadband Breakfast viewers are probably really up on their stuff, and so maybe this is unnecessary, but I will say for those who aren't entirely familiar that the Section 230 is a provision from the dates from the 96 Telecom Act that provides interactive computer services, which includes, but isn't limited to, digital services like social media, the legal certainty to moderate online content, knowing that if they take down some bad content but miss a needle in the haystack, that they're not thereby assuming legal responsibility for all bad actors on the internet through their efforts to remediate that misconduct which they come across. Right? So this is a critical provision of how digital services and in fact the entire digital economy works. And as Drew, you pointed out, the president's recently threatened to block national defense funding unless he gets his way on social media. And of course, Mr. Symington's nomination is in play because he was heavily involved in the president's efforts earlier this year to retaliate against digital companies that I think the president regarded as insufficiently loyal and for moderating disinformation or inaccurate public health information. And so I think in a big picture, what we're seeing happening is there are political axes are being. This is both the NDAA and the FCC nomination is an example of grinding political axes. Again, with respect to social media companies, frankly, at a time when the nation faces far greater threats, right? There's more than 250,000 Americans are dead, and we're talking about mean tweets about the president, right? And that shows that we've got our priorities mixed up. I think the question, to answer your question with a question, Drew, the question is to how long is Congress going to entertain this when there are far greater concerns afoot? Do I think that that support for American servicemen and national defense is going to be held up over Section 230? Probably not. I don't think that's going to happen, but I think this is illustrative of the fact that political point scoring is being allowed to take precedence over far more critical priorities. And that is important because I think it shows that we're going to be talking about Section 230 and the extent to which digital services moderate or don't moderate for a long time in the future. And of course, industry has taken a lot of steps and made great strides both on being more rigorous and transparent about what they've done, but that conversation is certainly going to continue well into next year.
Well, and thank you. Normally, I'm the one who has to tell people to back up and explain yourself, and you're telling me back up and explain what this is. And of course, during the three-part session we did, July 1, July 8, and July 15th, we really drilled into these issues of, content moderation and the impact on the elections, and which we've seen it has been in the periphery at least, as well as some of these other points about how it impacts our discussion online. Chip, I believe that Encompass has also weighed in on the Section 230. Could you give us a brief summary of your take on this, and also put on your congressional hat here? How would you act if you were still in Congress and a president of your party threatened to veto a bill that is likely to be pretty popular unless he gets his way on this issue?
Well, this is one of those cases where we thought with the election and with the pandemic that post-election, maybe we would enter into a period of peace and tranquility, but we're still in the storm before the calm. I do believe that the calm is coming and that the consensus is coming, but it's going to be January the 20th or sometime thereabout. If the president were to veto the the NDAA, I think that he would risk the chance of being overridden, and he probably would not want to have that defeat as he leaves office. So I think actually the confirmation of Symington may be a release valve that gives Trump a victory, although I think it is temporal, not permanent. That he could move the NPRM at the FCC, at least have a vote to start the NPRM. Do I think it will go anywhere next year? No, it will not go anywhere. What has a chance of actually happening on 230 in the next year? A bipartisan consensus around the Thune shots on transparency and trust, I think has a chance to be included sometime in the first year in the legislative agenda. And I think that we'll see an emerging consensus of where we maintain what has been the greatest success story in American economic innovation and internet history, really predicated around the protections of 230, will be preserved, but there will be greater disclosure. There'll be more trust. So for the internet companies that both Matt and I represent, and the network companies that we represent, I think it's incumbent upon us to find a way to create a greater understanding of the country, greater trust, let them see how moderation decisions are being made, how the algorithms are developed. And it really will be a period of time where we reach consensus in Congress on a bipartisan basis. And we reach out to the American public to say, we're in a race against China. The internet and the technology industry is what gives us the lead. We cannot cripple that part of our economy by taking away the very basis of what has made our internet economy, and all the applications and all the websites and all the small businesses to mid to large that depend upon 230 for their success. We'll find a middle ground. So storm now, calm, and consensus is coming post January the 20th.
Well, thanks for that perspective. It's certainly comforting to hear. And this is a good lead in actually to the question of net neutrality. Now, your two organizations are both, as you've just discussed, against these 230 petition for the FCC to take action. And actually, I'm not 100% sure. So without me stating your positions on net neutrality, please tell me briefly what they are. And given the likelihood that the Biden administration will seek to reverse, in my view, okay, I could be wrong, given my perspective that they are likely to attempt to reverse Chairman Ajit Pai's reversal of the prior administration, what do you make of your hope or your planned approach on this question? Let's start with you on this one, Chip, actually.
Sure. So as we look over the last decade, we had the Janikowski net neutrality, we had the Wheeler, we had the Pai. So we've had over the last 3 years a back and forth of net neutrality policies. There is a possibility that the Biden Commission moves quickly on reclassifying Title II, but they may also give a window of opportunity for Congress, because there's going to be a major infrastructure bill with a very significant broadband funding component. They may give Congress an opportunity to have a permanent solution that codifies the policies basically of the 2015 order, all of the principles of net neutrality and the oversight of interconnection, and look at maybe some of the issues emerging on an open internet, but to do so legislatively and permanently. So it's not this back and forth with every administration changing, because we're going to be trying to set investment certainty, a huge amount of public infrastructure funding, and then how do we also have the possibility of privacy, net neutrality, and the Consumer Competition Compact included in those first 100 days. And so there is an opportunity both with the commission to overturn and to reestablish net neutrality, or Congress to do so. And I think it's a 50-50 chance of which venue will be the one that puts net neutrality back in place.
Great perspective. Thank you. And I want to comment on that after Matt has a chance to weigh in as well.
So just to answer your question specifically, Drew, CCIA was an intervener in the Mozilla case in opposing the PI orders. The association supported the previous the Obama administration's open internet order, and I think for reasons we've already been discussing now, more than ever, it's evident that we need a free and open internet, and that the small businesses that are trying to use the internet to reach consumers during the crisis can access competitive broadband free of discrimination. And so that's a critical priority. I think Chip's prognostication about whether that happens through Congress or the FCC is interesting. I mean, certainly it's dead on that we've had this sort of flip-flop going back and forth between administrations, going back, over a decade now, arguably. Well over a decade, in fact. And so query whether or not there won't be legislative interest in trying to achieve a workable solution that persists. But in the absence of that, I do think it's quite likely that a new a Biden administration FCC is likely to want to return to the principles embraced by the Open Internet Order from the Obama administration.
Great, thank you.
And Drew, I would say this, that if it's at the commission, I think it would be done under Title II. If Congress addresses it, I think that there's a better possibility that it would be under a new title. And so as people weigh a consensus, those are major factors that would weigh in.
Yeah, no, thank you. Claude Aiken, who is the CEO of the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, has joined us even earlier than we were expecting. Thank you, Claude, for coming in as soon as you have. I don't know if you've heard, we talked about 230, Section 230, and now we're on net neutrality. And both of your co-panelists here have expressed support for the Wheeler policy on net neutrality, and I know you have a different perspective, so we look forward to hearing that. But keep in mind what Chip said, which I thought was a very interesting point, and I've been on the record in column or opinion I've expressed that this really is an issue Congress needs to deal with. It's just not a kind of acceptable from an administrative state standpoint for the flip to go every administration back and forth. So I think that's a very enticing suggestion there, Chip, but just don't know yet whether it's going to happen. So Claude, let's get your perspective on what Ajit Pai has done and where this issue goes in the Biden administration.
Sure. So I think it is, I kind of joined about halfway through the conversation. So, but I would absolutely agree with what Chip said at the end there, that Congress is likely to address it in a slightly different way than the FCC would using different authority. And look, our members are typically very small operators, and so they're very sensitive to the kind of regulatory burdens and barriers that DC would place on them as they're looking to deploy broadband to underserved communities. So things like onerous rules, things like whiplash back and forth between different regulatory regimes, those are all things that are a significant drag on their business. So look, these are folks who typically do not provide service with data caps. They don't have the market power or the wherewithal to block, to throttle, to engage in paid prioritization. So I think we are a little bit anxious about where this administration goes, but we're absolutely willing to and looking forward to engaging in a productive way. I think we were very pleased the last time around when there was a carve out for some of the rules for really small broadband operators. If we go down the path of having something more onerous, I think that's something that we would be looking for going forward in this administration. But we're happy to and looking forward to engage and tell our story both in front of Congress and the FCC.
Well, and WISP, but let's give you another chance or two to say a little bit about WISP, Claude. I mean, I think that the profile of your organization has certainly risen over the past half decade or more. And to what do you attribute the greater prominence of the wireless fixed provider impact in the broadband discussion in Washington, Claude?
Sure. I mean, I would like to take credit for it, but I absolutely can't. I think it's just the amazing work that our members have done in connecting the unconnected and connecting the underserved. It's to kind of give a little bit of background for folks who may not know who we are. WISPA is the organization that represents entrepreneurs and innovators in the internet space that are primarily providing service through fixed wireless connectivity. Our folks are predominantly very small and very rural, less than 1,500 subscribers per business, but we have over 1,000 members who are mostly small companies, and so that's what informs the perspective that we bring to the table, and just the ability that we've had to tell the story. As we all know, it takes 10 times communicating something to actually get it to go through. It's just kind of the repeated telling of that story of who our members are and what they've been doing, and the success that they have had in bringing underserved communities online, that I think is responsible for our ability to have the kind of seat at the table that WISPs do now. So I would attribute it all to the amazing work that our members have done.
Well, and I asked that because what I want us to talk now about is kind of broadband infrastructure investment, what form it will take, what the discussion is around. And when the last time there was a major discussion of this sort, 12 years ago, with the passage of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, WISPs were smaller player, right? They weren't as involved in things like reverse auctions that you are involved with now, as well as co-ops, as well as electric co-ops. And I should mention, we were so grateful to have the three of you on the panel. As a rule of thumb, we have to invite 3 times as many people as we have. So we've certainly invited more, and we are committed to including a diverse and group of people from all sides of discussions and walks of life and so forth. So just keep that in mind, that we're wanting to make sure the totality it represents that. Now, for broadband, one of our reporters is actually working on a piece about the Biden administration's plan for broadband. And what's interesting, as she's discovering, is that all 4 of the priorities that President-elect Biden highlighted in the last several months of his campaign, the pandemic, the economy, racial justice, and environmentalism, they really do tie into broadband. And that's kind of our understanding of how broadband is going to be discussed. So I'd like each of you, and let's start with you, Matt, to tell us what you think is the way either the Biden administration will approach broadband investment or Congress will take it, and what you think are ways they should approach it, right? What are lessons learned from the past? What are some aspects of your experience that are worth including?
So thanks, Drew. I think I alluded to previously, I think the administration should and will regard broadband, increasing broadband as a way of providing opportunity both to historically underserved communities and to businesses, particularly small businesses that have been hit disproportionately by the pandemic. And so broadband is a means to an end to achieve the publicly stated goal of the administration to increase economic opportunity. And as Chip referred to previously, I think the pandemic, if there's been any silver lining, which guess you can't really say it is, but there's, some recognition of the fact that broadband is critical to economic prosperity in so many different ways. And now, unfortunately, it's become essential for business and learning and socialization. And so utilizing broadband as the means to an end of increasing economic equality and promoting prosperity for everyone, I think is most important. So how do you do that? We talked about that to some extent previously, increasing support for funding for broadband deployment, in promoting infrastructure, trying to craft rules, whether it's spectrum rules or standards and principles about procurement to increase the likelihood of additional deployment of 5G tech by American companies. There is a variety of tools in that toolbox, but ultimately I think they all point back towards using broadband deployment as a means to promote opportunity and growth for small businesses.
And using broadband to solve those problems. Chip, what's your take on how the administration is or should roll out a broadband plan?
Well, I've had a good chance to talk with the Biden transition team, and really they have a very deep, talented, experienced group beginning to set the agenda for the first 100 days. And we talked about how do you create a policy for broadband for all, competition for all, and equity for all. And then another category would be how do you create the trust and the transparency and somewhat of a new competitive compact or consumer compact around the privacy, the 230, the content, and those issues. We're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the 1996 in February. So within that first 100-day window, and does the major stimulus and infrastructure bill give us an opportunity to possibly create kind of the next iteration of a major telecommunications act, where the principle of universality now goes from voice to broadband? And how do we create the competition policy that we're technology neutral, competitively neutral? In the 96 Act, one of the cornerstones was how do networks, wireless, wired, competitive, incumbent, how do they interconnect on an equal basis? Well, net neutrality is how do we make sure that the consumer has equal access to content as well as equal interconnection policy? And now we're looking at privacy and 230 issues, which are really trust and security issues. Do we have an opportunity in the first 100 days and on the 25th anniversary or the year of the 25th anniversary of 96 Act, really to reset a 21st century policy that will look forward using these enduring principles, but really conforming and promoting legislatively and with our funding and the parameters, a great opportunity to really do something that hasn't been done in 2.5 decades. So I think the Biden administration is looking to go bold and big on these on broadband issues. So
just to take a minute or two on this before we get Claude's perspective on this, I mean, both prospects are quite enticing and interesting. It's funding broadband and redoing the 96 Telecom Act, but can they really be done together? Is that really realistic given how much of these innards are going to pop out when you open them up in terms of the sections of the Telecom Act?
Well, money helps solve a lot of problems. And when you have this much money being discussed, so the Clyburn bill, you're looking at $100 billion of broadband infrastructure spending. Now that is almost unimaginable. I mean, and never before would have even been proposed. But you also you have Jeb Bush and you have many Republicans who are now promoting the same type level of funding under the same type of commitment that our nation undertook coming out of the Depression, that every American would be connected to electricity. I think that same commitment is now on the broadband commitment to every American in every place and community. And when you have that much money at stake, it's much easier to solve problems like net neutrality, to solve problems like 230, to solve problems, because everybody will have a stake in it, and there will be a lot of ways to do win-win balancing politically. As a former member of Congress and staffer, in that context, when you don't do so, if you're doing just straight policy without many sweeteners or carrots, it is much more difficult. We're about to go into a funding-rich environment, which helps solve a lot of problems.
Great perspective. Let's get Claude's take on this question, and then we're going to open up to questions. Keep asking your questions. Those of you who are participating on Zoom via the chat window, if you're on other the platforms, feel free to ask them. Those will get through to us as well. And if you particularly want to ask them online live, we have the ability to turn that on. So Claude, tell us, what are WISPA members thinking and saying about a possible stimulus? And maybe, if you don't mind, including some discussion about the role that WISPA members have been playing on some of the other auction-related activities at the Federal Communications Commission.
Sure. So I think, to echo what Matt and Chip have already said, I think we see there's tremendous opportunity here. And in our conversations with the fantastic transition team, we've been able to kind of highlight what we think are some of the key priorities in our mind, which is, as Chip mentioned, tech neutrality. You've got to make space at the table for all players, particularly for folks who have been historically, marginalized in funding programs, newcomers to the table. We've got to get things out there quickly. I hear from members every day who are working 18 to 20-hour days and have been for the past 8 months, just because of the incredible demand that they're seeing for connectivity. And lessons learned from past stimulus packages, I think we've got to take into account that they've got to be shovel ready. You've got to have an impact right off the bat. We have seen some success from our members historically in these funding programs as a result of the increased recognition of the value and the model that our providers used as community-based providers in underserved areas. But there are a lot of folks who are still on the sidelines. It's really only the largest 10% or so of our members who have had the ability to participate in these because of some of the barriers that we've seen put in place, and some of it is legacy and could be addressed through an update of the Telecom Act, as Chip was saying, moving from a voice-centric world to a broadband-centric world. I think there's incredible recognition around that. There's incredible momentum around the recognition of broadband as a critical service to all communities. And it's something that our members are excited about, but also want to make sure that what they've been doing with their businesses, having gone into credit card debt to start their business, that they're not being overbuilt. They're being taken into account for these programs, and that they continue to have the recognition and the seat at the table that they deserve in these contexts.
Well, thank you for that. Now, we want to open it up to our audience again. Keep asking questions. I'll start to ask some of these via the chat window. If you want to go on camera and you're on our Zoom platform, just send a private message to myself or Leanna Soa and indicate that, and then we'll kind of tee it up for you. But and actually, let me go ahead and ask the first of these questions here that we got about what is your sense of the chance that, this is from Michael Shear, what is your sense of the chance to begin the discussion of problems of vertical integration of content and access? Okay, and so if I may kind of build on that, obviously the Time Warner, AT&T, the content side of Time Warner, not the Time Warner Cable, the content side and the merger with AT&T that obviously was challenged but permitted by court decision, raises some of these issues, and it's kind of continuing in the background. But let's again hear from all of you, Matt, Chip, and Claude, if you have perspectives on this question of vertical integration. What concerns are there? What concerns aren't there?
So yeah, I think Michael's question is an interesting one, because while I think shared the concerns around the Time Warner transaction that you referenced, Drew, there can be a lot of pro-consumer benefits to vertical integration, ensuring that whether it's in this case content services are more readily available at lower prices in different packages to consumers. The problem is usually arises when the integration is happening where consumers don't have a meaningful choice, right? And that kind of the classic example of that I think people think about is the Microsoft operating system and the browser. The problem with the integration, of course, is that people didn't have many meaningful choices in operating systems. And so applied here, that's all about trying to achieve what Chip was referring to earlier, which is having more options, more choice to consumers of their broadband provider. And when those choices are available, a lot of the concerns that would arise from vertical integration go away, because if the vertical integration results in the broadband provider trying to screw its customers, then those customers can go somewhere else. A lot of the problems around net neutrality arise out of the fact, or the reason for the net neutrality policy discussion, it arises out of the fact that there are limits to consumers' broadband options. And I know where I'm from in upstate New York, there are relatively few meaningful broadband options. So my parents who still live there, if they want to Zoom with the family, they pretty much have one choice. Now here in the district, I'm fortunate, I can choose between two. If any one of those companies gets up to no good and engages in misbehavior, I can at least switch to one other alternative. We want every consumer to have those kinds of options. And so I think we need to recognize that there are values to vertical integration, and that the problems really arise when there isn't broadband choice. And so the solution to that problem isn't maybe so much to focus on the vertical integration itself, but ensuring that consumers can choose where they get their broadband.
Yep. And Claude, what are your reactions to that?
Well, I would just add to Matt, I do think that competition and multiple network providers solves a lot of problems on the vertical integration. The other way is, and this is more to the companies that have size and scale that are vertically integrated, whether it's a Comcast or an AT&T, that in many markets may have a much greater concentration economically in local and regional, and sometimes in national markets. But net neutrality can solve that problem. I have sympathy for Claude and Wispin a lot in ACA and a lot of smaller broadband providers who really don't have either the vertical integration of both content and distribution, and don't have the means or the motives to discriminate. Where you do may in the other part of the market, where you have a Comcast or an AT&T or a Verizon, they would have both the means and the motives. And a good net neutrality policy can protect against those types of things. And the other remedy is to make sure that we have every form of network, fiber, wireless, fixed, satellite, competing and offering choices to people in every place.
Claude, channeling Chip, how do you design a net neutrality policy that only applies to 3 companies, right? No, just just kidding. Go ahead and address your.
No, I think it's kind of funny how I think our providers would love to have some degree of vertical integration, because it would save them costs. It wouldn't keep their the owners of the company from being yelled at the grocery store if something went wrong with the network or they did something shady. but yeah, it's really not something that is even on our members' radar, because it's not an issue for them, except for as a competitive issue when they're trying to go into an underserved area, and you have a vertically integrated provider that is pulling on those levers to try to corner them out. So it is a tough question. Historically, we have seen Democrat-led administrations more willing to tackle those kind of difficult issues. So I would think that this administration would be no different, and we'll actively engage on it, but that's not really an issue for our members.
Sure. No, fair point. Good questions coming in. Keep them coming. I've got a couple I want to ask too, but let's keep with our panelists here. There's a discussion here in the chat about the definition of broadband. This is from Edward Barrett, many in our community, of our community clients are struggling to receive federal funding for projects based on 25.3 definition, one that many feel is now inadequate. Do you see any possible movement off the 25.3 standard in the coming years? And of course, 25.3 refers to 25 megabits per second down and 3 megabits per second up. I'm just going to go on record and say I'm an advocate of saying we should measure broadband speed by multiplying the downstream by the upstream, so that you're measuring your broadband speed score of 100 by 100 or 10,000, right? Or a gigabit by gigabit, or I can't even do my math here, but the idea being, let's focus on that. But I'm going to get pushback. I know. I say that just to be provocative and to get each of your perspectives. Let's start with you, Claude. Should we change the speed definition or not? What are some advantages to not changing it?
So I think the advantages, some of the advantages to not changing it are that you have predictability in subsidy mechanisms, and you have predictability for providers that are trying to figure out where the federal government is going to go in terms of where its broadband policy is going to lie. Because it was just, maybe like 10 years ago that 4.1 was considered the gold standard for broadband, and here we are talking about gigabit speeds. I think where we come down on this is what do consumers actually need, and what are they using? So it's no secret that COVID's put a strain on the capacity of some networks and has caused folks to scramble to upgrade. I think I've been really proud of what our members have done. We've done some research to see what the impact has been, what consumer usage has been. The most popular packages that we're seeing purchased are still the 25.3 packages, even when symmetrical 100 by 100 gigabit are available. That may go into a broader discussion about affordability and things of that nature too. But what consumers are actually buying is what they need. And what consumers are actually using and what they're doing with the network is still heavily asymmetrical. So I would be
symmetrical or asymmetrical?
Asymmetrical. So,
okay.
Somewhere between 10-to-1 and 7-to-1 download to upload split.
Let's keep moving. Chip, do you agree or disagree on this perspective?
This is where I'm gonna try to be controversial, and I'll be in disagreement. We should be symmetrical. We should, if we're going to spend over the next 5 years anywhere from $50 to $100 billion, it should be with a standard of 1 gig, or moving to that standard of 1 gig. And if we're going to win the race against China on 5G, it is going to be fiber rich and fiber and fixed. And we need to have the highest standard possible. If you look over the last decade on a bipartisan basis, we have spent billions and billions and billions of dollars to sustain copper networks. That is a failure. If we're going to go to the future, it ought to be future-proof. It ought to be 1 gig, and we ought to have a moonshot of the highest standard as fast as possible. And the COVID has taught us that the current standards are not sufficient. And if we're going to win the race globally and competitively, we have to go to 1 gig. And for the last 4 years, Encompass has been advocating for our 1 gig standard.
Well, let's keep moving. Another question from our attendees. Tell us about your take on this issue of broadband mapping. Okay, another issue we've been very aware of and involved in. The Federal Communications Commission is seeking to move from the traditional and somewhat controversial Form 477 to a digital opportunity data collection. Is fixing this a gateway to more intelligent federal funding? Again, let's start with Claude, Chip, and Matt.
Sure. So I hope this is an area where we can find some more agreements. I think we are optimistic. We've worked pretty closely with the FCC on its digital opportunity data collection. We were supportive of Congress's efforts to pass the Broadband Data Act. I think that needs to be fully funded. We do agree that we need more granular data out there about where broadband is and isn't, because that's the necessary prerequisite. Regardless of what speed broadband you're trying to get out there, you need to have an idea of where we are before we can fully figure out where we want to go.
Yep. Quick thoughts on that?
I would agree with Claude. We need to fully fund the broadband mapping. It is critical. We do need to change the standards, not only of where competition is present, but actually where broadband is being adopted and being used. And so we need a fuller definition as we look at broadband, and it's critical to get our funding right with accurate data on the maps. So it should be one of the top priorities in the new Biden administration and with any legislation that could be passed.
I'll give you a chance to respond to this, but I'm going to introduce our next topic, which I suspect you want to weigh in on. And I don't know if everyone heard this the way I heard it, but Chip made a reference to moving from voice-based to broadband-based. And I read that as potential big change to the Universal Service Fund and the method of contributions. Right now, of course, it's only telecommunications-based connections that are assessed, and the assessment's now up to 27 points, 27%. So that's effectively a 27% tax on telecommunications service and 0 on broadband. And if I'm reading Chip right, you may want to change that. So you'll give a chance to correct that. But Matt, what are your thoughts? Do you have, as an association or you personally, thoughts on this question of the Universal Service Fund contributions and taxation of broadband services?
So has the association commented on this recently? I know it's been a little bit of time, but I think further to what you're saying, I don't think there's any question, including among our constituents, that the manner in which we've structured universal service has outlived its usefulness. It needs to be modernized, and that structuring it around voice is driving while looking in the rearview mirror. We need to adopt a forward-looking model, and you didn't even need the pandemic to show you that model is got to be focused around broadband and trying to achieve universal service for voice while ignoring the elephant in the room is terrible policy. So we need to modernize there.
Yeah.
Yep. You want to supplement what Matt or I said there?
Yeah, I do think one of the big potential changes in the next 2 years will be universal service and how we provide the subsidies, both in delivery, but also in the funding and collection mechanism. There's an early conversation beginning and an emerging conversation. Should we move to an appropriation-based model versus a fee-based model? John Marsh with AT&T wrote a blog recommending that. It's time for us to look at that. And the $100 billion in infrastructure spending on broadband that is being discussed on the legislative side may give us the means by which we make that transition. The current system is not sustainable. As you just talked about, we're approaching a 30% universal service fee, and the ability to expand that pool is very, very difficult politically. And if we're going to make a national commitment to broadband to all this is where the philosophical change, the paradigm change of actually having an appropriation-based model may emerge over the next year or 2 years in a very real way.
Good. Well, good perspective. Claude, where does WISPA come down on this question?
Sure. So I would wholeheartedly agree that I like the driving while looking in the rearview mirror. I may have to steal that one. We absolutely agree, particularly when you're talking rural and you're talking what's considered served versus unserved. We've agreed that there are many problems with the FCC's Form 477 data, but one of the huge problems from our perspective is that an area is only colored in if you're offering both voice and broadband. And voice is increasingly a service that consumers do not want, particularly in a fixed context. So we have members who are offering voice for no other reason than to meet regulatory obligations, and have very few or even zero customers actually taking the service. So I'd wholeheartedly agree that it's time to transition more towards a broadband centric model of funding and just regulation in general. That's something that we need to make that leap for the good of the country.
Well teed up for future discussions on that issue in the future. I promised that we cut off right at 1. So I want to give every one of you a final word. We didn't get to spectrum, which I'd love to get Claude and Chip and Matt's take on that. So we just got a question coming in on education and E-rate reform, both of which are vital and highlighted by the pandemic. So I'm just going to kind of open it up. Let's do Chip, Claude, and Matt on this order here. Closing thoughts on other issues that need to be dealt with. So go ahead, Chip.
So under Equity for All, new funding and more funding for the E-rate program, competitive telemedicine, telehealth, and Lifeline. So those will be the 3 tools to help achieve greater equity and close the digital divide. On a spectrum issue, 12 gigahertz, very important that we get a neutral NPRM before the end of this year and hopefully finished into the next year to look at opening up 12 gigahertz, which could be critical to WISPA and other members who might use that in their fixed wireless systems. I'll close there. We have a great opportunity to see the biggest change in telecommunications and technology policy in the last 2 decades. And I think an emerging consensus around broadband to all is going to happen.
Excellent. Thank you for being with us. Claude.
I would agree. I think we're on the cusp of something great here in terms of broadband policy. We just have to seize the moment. On spectrum side, look, I think there's an emerging recognition that it's not just the largest players who are going to be avid acquirers and users of spectrum. We saw more licenses in CBRS taken home by WISPs than by all of the big mobile providers combined. And so I think there's a growing recognition that we need to take a look at where spectrum is actually being used and putting it to its best and highest use. And a lot of that comes together through, when you're talking license, you're talking smaller geographic areas. When you're talking incumbent spectrum, you're talking sharing. And as table stakes, you're always talking more unlicensed spectrum. So that's something we'd like to see out of the new administration. And I'll stop there.
Thanks for being with us. Matt, you get the last word for our discussion here today.
Well, not a lot of time for the last word, but I'm happy to say maybe I don't need it, seeing as that I found so much among what Chip and Claude said that I can agree with. I think there's a lot of consensus here, that both about the importance of the opportunity that's before us, as well as about what precisely we can be doing to roll out and deploy more broadband at this crucial hour. So I wouldn't add anything else other than to say thanks for having us, Drew.
Well, thank you to each of you, Matt and Chip and Claude. I want to thank our sponsor for this series, Broadband Now. We're very grateful for They're stepping up on this series, as well as all of our sponsors for our series on 5G, which will be next week. Samsung is our sponsor, and that will be discussing rights of way for 5G services. And then the week after, on the 16th, Tools for Broadband Deployment, sponsored by Render Networks and Adtran. And we'll be talking that week about some of the key steps to getting networks built efficiently. See you next week. Broadband Breakfast Live Online. Thank you again for being